Hello and welcome. My name is Rusty Rickart, and I'm a FEMA Hazard Mitigation Specialist based out of Region 5 offices in Chicago. I was asked by FEMA headquarters to talk to you all today on the topic of how management costs are structured under the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. What I am going to discuss is valuable information applicable to a wide audience, including state, agency, and tribal officials, whom I'll refer to in this talk as recipients. Also, it's good information for local jurisdiction leadership, whom I often reference as sub-recipients, and additionally the federal workforce listeners, including you FEMA staff. Therefore, my talk is being video recorded so that the content of the presentation is easily accessible for viewing convenience. And on that note, I want to mention that my narration is meant to enhance the learning experience. For the sake of time, I do not cover every single word on every single slide in the upcoming show. But the beauty of a video like this is that you can pause it as often as you need to in order to read the details of the written information. So with that, let's get going. In case you were wondering, why would FEMA want to spend the time to do a deep dive on the topic of Hazard Mitigation Grant Program management costs? Hasn't that aspect of the program already been around since the Stafford Act? The shorter answer is that although a management cost has indeed been a part of HMGP since its inception in some form or another, its very structure was dramatically altered by the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018. That's often called the DRRA. Some people call it the DRRA. And that is the reason why I'm sharing today. FEMA would like those of you familiar with management costs to be aware of the changes. And if you are new to the HMGP, then you won't have to unlearn some things like some of us old timers. But when you read the DRRA legislation, it quickly becomes evident that Congress was very direct in their intent when they modified the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program management cost superstructure. I personally see two big themes: making management cost funds available for quick post-disaster mitigation activity at the recipient level, and increasing the amount of funding available, which provides management cost dollars as a resource for capacity building at both the recipient and sub-recipient levels. Here's an outline of what we're going to unpack together during the course of today's presentation. I will speak about both the process side, some mechanics as to how FEMA derives and delivers management costs, and the administration side, how the management costs are operationalized at the recipient and sub-recipient level. Please take note of the hyperlink here, as it is the landing page on FEMA.gov whereby you can burrow in to find valuable resource materials, such as the management cost relevant items that I have listed on my next slide. FEMA headquarters is constantly striving to provide the rules and tools that allow regions to best serve the states, territories, tribes, local governments, and ultimately the citizens of our country. The listings here are those that are most relevant to this management cost topic and represent hundreds of hours of work by dedicated professionals who have created the documents that are the go-to resources to guide program delivery. It should be noted that a revision of the 2015 version of the Hazard Mitigation Assistance, sometimes we call that the HMA, guidance, is currently underway, and that update will incorporate all of the DRRA management cost changes. Until then, the last bullet, the management cost crosswalk, is a handy shortcut. And the second to last bullet is also highlighted here, as it is the bridge between the DRRA law and the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program management cost framework that we will be discussing. It is the skeleton. At this point, I also do need to make a disclaimer that nothing in this training is intended to conflict with the interim management cost policy or the HMA guidance. If there is a perceived or actual conflict, then the policy and guidance are the governing documents. Hopefully right now you're sitting in a comfortable chair and are ready to take a journey with me to learn more about FEMA Hazard Mitigation Grant Program management costs. I am ready to share. I'm going to read the first bullet on this slide as it is the very bedrock statement in the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program management cost interim policy. Management costs are indirect costs, direct administrative costs, or any other administrative expense associated with a specific project under a major disaster, emergency, or disaster preparedness or mitigation activity or measure. This definition provides us with the overarching idea of what constitutes management costs. And you can see it is separate and distinct from project costs. Additionally, management costs in HMGP are in addition to the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program pool of project funding that is made available in each disaster. They are not taken out of the HMGP ceiling. The money that is the money that is made available for project awards. Plus, the management costs are 100% federal funding. Neither recipients nor sub-recipients will need to provide a 25% non-Fed cost share, like is the requirement for project work. I will cover the other points on this slide in coming slides, so let's move on ahead. This slide lists two of the big management cost changes that were brought about by the DRRA. But without a comparison background, you may not realize what they are. One, the total amount of HMGP management costs made available in each disaster doubled under the DRRA. The previous formula was at a 4.89% calculation, and under DRRA it went up to 15%. And secondly, the 15% pool was split into two dedicated portions. One portion for the recipient, which is 2/3 of the total, or 10% of that 15 total, and one portion for the sub-recipient, which is the remaining 1/3 or 5%. I also want to advise you that throughout the presentation, if I use the term RMC, I mean recipient management costs. Likewise, SRMC is, you guessed it, sub-recipient management costs. Tribes who experience disaster events upon their tribal lands are able to request federal declarations, just like a state or territory can. If they are granted a major disaster declaration and HMGP is designated as a program within the tribal boundaries, then they would have both a dedicated HMGP pot of money and their own proprietary respective management cost pool available. So in those situations, a recognized federal applicant tribe can apply for the 10% recipient management costs and the 5% sub-recipient management costs for tribal-sponsored projects in the subaward, which is different than the limit put upon the state recipients, who may not apply for the additional 5% sub-award management costs, even if the project is being sponsored by the recipient state agency. Okay, don't worry, I'm not going to launch into an astronomy lesson here. This visual is just meant to depict that there is a relationship present within the HMGP universe that is important to understand. See what I did there? At the very basic level of the overall size of a disaster, in terms of FEMA Disaster Relief Fund dollars expended, represented by the sun here, being the individual assistance and public assistance grant program funding, that drives the corresponding size of the HMGP pot of money, represented as the orbiting planet, which in turn determines the size of the management cost pool, represented by the moon. All right, I'll admit there's a whole lot going on here, but let me walk you through it. If we start with the orange disk in the upper left corner, hint, that's our sun from the previous slide, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program ceiling is calculated via a 15% formula, or 20% for those states, tribes, or territories that have an enhanced mitigation plan. Those HMGP FEMA grant funds that are shown as the multicolored pie chart in the right in the bottom center of this visual. Combining our disk of many colors there with the light blue disk on the left, we arrive at the 100% total amount of HMGP associated with this disaster. That is our FEMA 75% plus the required non-Fed match of 25% that I spoke of earlier. If you are still with me, then we are now going to take this DR HMGP funding pool, that is the dark blue disk in the bottom right corner, and apply an independent 15% formula to calculate the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program management cost pot. That is the top right red disk. Phew, that seems like a lot, but honestly, it wasn't that hard, I hope. And note that as I previously stated, the management cost pot is split into its respective RMC and SRMC portions. So by the way, we repeat those calculation processes 3 times in each disaster. A 30-day estimate, which is provided 30 days post-disaster declaration and typically reflects the individual and household program assistance requests and some mission assignments from the individual assistance program. And public assistance estimates at this point in time will be very crude and incomplete. At 6 months, though, most of the IHP and mission assignment costs will be known and PA estimates will be more complete. And then a final lock-in is that at 1 year was when we issued that one. And this occasionally may be lower than the 6-month estimate if the PA repair and replace estimates were too high early on, which can be a common occurrence. As I noted in the table here, the first 2 computations, 30 days and 6 months, are estimated, and then we do what we call the lock-in at the 1 year point in time. This chart does an excellent job of showing how there are tiered limits associated with each snapshot, and furthermore, that there are 2 different categories of recipient. Those that have both an enhanced mitigation plan and a program administration by state agreement with FEMA are allowed to access the larger portions of their RMC than the standard recipients. Also note that the withheld funds can be requested after the last non-management cost subaward has been completed, so funds are available to support closeout activities. And by the way, the reason for that holdback is to provide an incentive to timely closeout of all projects. This slide and the next one will look very similar, and that is on purpose. The key concept to take away here is a principle for FEMA to manage the Disaster Relief Fund, or DRF, very closely. In 2012, FEMA implemented a new initiative called Strategic Fund Management, or SFM, and or incremental funding. Strategic Fund Management is designed to provide HMGP funding in increments based on the subrecipient's work schedule and ability to execute eligible activities. SFM does not change the project eligibility process. It's just a new method for approving work and providing funds as they are needed. In essence, there is not a need to push out something like $3 million in project funding if the subrecipient can only complete $750,000 of work on approved work activities in a single year. FEMA will approve the total budget, but dole out the funding in increments sufficient to keep the work going. The stockpile of federal money sitting in a recipient bank account is not a prudent grants management practice, and it depletes the DRF unnecessarily. All HMGP project recipient management cost apps over $1 million must be reviewed to determine whether the project is a candidate for SFM. Additionally, as you can see on this slide, FEMA is requiring recipients to provide a yearly increment budget with any RMC app over $500,000. As I said, this next slide looks very similar to the last, but please note that we treat SRMC state subrecipient management costs in the same manner. All subrecipient management costs are awarded in conjunction with projects over $1 million. They will follow the SFM, and those project apps that are over $500,000 will need to include the yearly increment breakdown. And I don't believe I have explained this piece yet, but the SRMC computation is done based on a total cost of the project. It is capped at 5% for each individual project. For example, if the subrecipient submits a project application with a budget of $800,000 in total cost, the subrecipient can apply for up to $40,000 in management costs. That's the 5% calculation on $800,000 total. But because the subrecipient management cost amount is over $25,000, $40,000 larger than $25,000, the incremental obligation step is required. The subrecipient can ultimately be awarded $40,000 in management costs. However, the initial obligation amount is the amount needed for the first year of the project. and then an additional amount will be obligated annually each subsequent years based on the need until the $40,000 amount total is reached. I also want to note that if a SRMC amount higher than $25,000 can be justified, the documentation is provided with the app that proves that the SRMC funding can be used within that 1-year time frame, then FEMA can award. Perhaps in the sample project that we were just talking about, the mitigation activity being undertaken is very technical and will require the involvement of extremely high-paid personnel during implementation, and their salaries push the 1-year SRMC budget up to the full $40,000. In order to properly transmit the correct amounts of RMC and SRMC available at 30 days, 6 months, and 1 year, FEMA created a management cost calculator. A little later in the presentation, I will give a short demonstration in this MS Excel calculator tool. This slide is showing us that recipients can apply for funds with a budget narrative, schedule, and detailed budget for immediate needs management costs as early as the 30-day post-disaster estimate, as well as at the 6-month estimate to jumpstart their HMGP application development. Immediate needs is usually considered funds needed until the 12-month HMGP ceiling is established. And as we discussed a moment ago, the concept of incremental funding generally comes into play with the release of the final 1-year lock-in ceiling. However, in catastrophic disasters, the typical is tossed out on its ear. Large events can see rapid increases of staffing needs, and post-event activities may be fast-tracked, given that resources are in abundance. It is important to keep in mind the overarching timeframe that is in play here. Hazard Mitigation Grant Program project implementation to accomplish all approved scope of work activities must be completed within the period of performance, or the POP. Therefore, the corresponding management cost needs, both recipient management cost and sub-recipient management cost, will follow suit and of the period of performance. A few notes I want to make here. Sub-recipients apply for management costs through their state, tribe, territory hazard mitigation officer. That's the recipient level. Sub-recipient management cost funds are not automatically added to the grant award and will always require some level of support material. Recall that the over $25,000 amounts of sub-recipient management costs trigger a detailed narrative and itemized budget need. Sub-recipient management costs can only be used to the specific project that they are awarded to as well. We have been using the term apply for instead of request, as it is an important concept to recognize that management costs are not automatically provided. Additionally, I have mentioned that SRMC is calculated at a max of 5% of the total cost, but realize that the actual SRMC award may be less than that, if that is all that can be justified. In other words, the 5% is not a default amount. So at this point, let's do a little review. I'll read through the questions on the next slide and pause for a moment so that you can review the multiple choice options that are listed and pick the best answer. Then I can reveal the answer key. So the first question, Hazard Mitigation Grant Program management costs are indirect and direct administrative costs available to both recipients and sub-recipients. Question 2, recipients are eligible for up to blank % of the total HMGP disaster-specific lock-in value. Question 3, the recipient receives their final management cost award based on the 6-month estimate. And question 4, incremental management costs allow a recipient to support the following. I'll let you think about it for 1 moment. And here are the correct answers. In this next section, we will spend a little time discussing some budget development aspects. So whenever a budget is being developed, you need to keep in mind the kind of money that is being applied for. Management cost monies are intended to fund different activities than what project funds are used for. So recalling the very definition of management costs helps to keep us on the right path for identifying the relevant management cost budget items. This might be a good time to hit pause in the video and thoroughly read this slide. Basically, these are the answers to the test. The kinds of things that should make their way into a management cost budget. And note that in the light blue text box, those are highlighted. That's highlighted to demonstrate that these are costs that are eligible project costs, but ineligible in a management cost proposal, as they are not administrative management cost related actions. Indirect costs are only eligible when included with recipient or sub-recipient management costs. They are ineligible for project costs and should not be included in a project budget. For a deeper dive on indirect costs, you should review 2 CFR 200.414. In situations where the non-Fed is contributing over 25%, there will be no recalculation of the SRMC pool. Those amounts are static to the one-year calculation, Fed plus non-Fed. So although the simple way to think about the SRMC computation is that it is done based on the total cost of the project, not just the federal share, you do also have to remember that the calculation is up to a maximum of the traditional 75-25 share scenario. In other words, we do not provide additional SRMC in situations where the non-Fed overmatch funds are being contributed to a project. Again, why not hit the pause button here and take a moment to really absorb this comprehensive list of things management costs will support. These are as close as we get to industry standards. Understanding what these are and knowing about them as a group is critical to practical grants management. In the context of management costs, procured services are most likely to be contractual services for subject matter experts to assist with Hazard Mitigation Grant Program application development. Things like benefit cost analysis, development, project management, accounting, and auditing. When procuring property and services under a federal award, state and territorial governments must comply with the requirements of the Code of Federal Regulations. That's 2 CFR section 200.317, procurement by states. A couple of key takeaways from this slide are that procurement procedures exist for a reason. They are meant to be followed. And then you have to ask yourself the question, how do you prove that you did your procurement properly? Do you have the documentation to show your work? When developing a management cost budget, it is very important to provide a clear narrative. The details do matter. Make sure that you have covered the who, what, where, when, and why in your description of how management costs will be used. Double check that your quantities make sense, that your values are appropriate, and that the items you have listed can all be shown to support actual program implementation. It is often useful for a programmatic person and a financial services person to jointly create and review the management cost proposal together before submission. As we can see on this slide, we're given a scenario about a certain event, a certain disaster event. And if I were in a room with you personally, I would be able to interact at this point and begin a discussion about management costs, and what the recipient with only a schmo on staff in the state mitigation department may need to administer their hazard mitigation grant program. So I would encourage you to pause the video and take in this scenario. But some factors that you might want to consider as you think about it are that the FEMA region will provide the 30-day and 6-month management cost lock-in estimates. For discussion, let's assume that the 30-day management cost estimates for this scenario was $250,000. At 30 days, 2/3 of that $250,000 is available to the recipient to get applicant briefings completed and going, and start ramping up on the program for this smallish disaster. At 6 months, they should have the full capacity to support the sub-recipients in application development and perform strong application reviews, even if that requires contractual subject matter expertise. And at the 1-year point, the region will provide that final 1-year lock-in, and the recipient can shift their program, supported by management costs, toward Hazard Mitigation Grant Program project administration. As was mentioned earlier, FEMA created a management cost calculator. The image here shows a portion of the blank spreadsheet. I will now begin a demonstration of the actual tool and give you a peek behind the curtain at the actual way it functions. And here we are inside of the management cost calculator. Let me talk this through with you very briefly. The top portions are just meant to show as I've already discussed, some of the layers and the tiers that are involved for the different calculators, and the formulas that are, the formulas that are in this calculator that are behind the scenes, because there is that difference between a regular state and an enhanced and program administration by state. So we change these values to be able to have the formulas changed correspondingly. This example that we're looking at is a standard state with the, as you can see here, the 50% that's allowed at 6 months and the 25% that's allowed at 30 days. And then also the holdback, the withholding is different between a regular state and an enhanced state. It's 3% for a regular, 2% for an enhanced. So then moving down, we'll just go from left to right here. The calculations that we perform at 30 days, the field we input is what is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program pool of money. That is the 75% federal share. In this example, we're using the number of 5 million. When we input that 5 million, the formulas work behind the scenes to tell us what the total cost would be, adding in 25% more of non-Fed share, and then what the corresponding management cost would be, that 15% calculation based on the total cost. So in this example, we come out with a nice even $1 million of total. But that management cost, remember, is split into 2 portions, a recipient management cost and a sub-recipient management cost. And then further, we limit the amount of money that can go out at any given time. So at 30 days, in a regular state, we are limiting the amount to 25% of the recipient management, 2/3 or 10%, and we do not do a withhold or a holdback calculation on the subrecipient. So the full amount is available across the full spectrum of projects that would be submitted. Moving over to the middle columns here, the 6-month calculation, you can see in our example that we've gone up. The management cost total has, or the HMGP pot has gone up. And correspondingly then, the total cost has gone up, and correspondingly, the management cost calculation for the total pool has gone up. And again, we do only release 75% of the funds, 50% of the funds at this point for a regular, 75 for an enhanced state. So in this example as regular, it's a 50% calculation, and that's yielding this $416,000, 666 figure you see here. And likewise, the subrecipient amount you can compare, has gone up as well. And then at the 1-year point, when we've done the final lock-in, in this example, we have increased pretty substantially and gone up to $10 million of HMGP. And the calculations are repeated again, total cost, total amount of management cost available. And then this is where the withholding comes into play. So we, again, are splitting this into the recipient portion, the subrecipient portion, but now we will not release that final total amount of money available to the state for the recipient funds. Instead, we're going to withhold in this case, regular state 3%, which is $40,000, and that yields this number over here to the right, almost $1.3 million of recipient management costs and $666,667 of subrecipient. So the point of this exercise was just to give you a little peek, as I said, behind the curtain of what our calculator looks like. Most regions do not share the calculator and provide this to their states or their tribes or territories, but they convey the information in correspondence letters that is derived out of these calculators. Take a moment to think back to that earlier table that I showed that displayed the tiers of recipient management cost available at the various lock-in points in time. At 30 days, 25% of the full recipient management cost is available. And at 6 months, the recipient should be capable to support local sub-recipients in application development and performing strong application reviews. And if you look at the example here, the slide, this is just showing you a little summary of what we just went through in our example with the inside of the actual calculator tool. Repeating the numbers so that you've got a nice chance to look at them and digest how they've changed over time between the difference between the 30-day point snapshot and the 6-month snapshot. So building on the scenario, again, here are the eligible management cost budget categories. You saw this once before. It's very important to remember these and think about how the various line items here and categories would be handled and addressed in a recipient management cost request. Speaking of that, here's a proposed recipient management cost budget that was developed. After receipt of the 30-day estimate, the recipient should be thinking through the management of their Hazard Mitigation Grant Program portfolio in 2 segments. One, supporting subrecipients in application preparation, review of applications, and submittal of the grant package to FEMA. And 2, the post-award management of their Hazard Mitigation Grant Program subrecipient projects. The 30-day estimate will likely be small unless it's a very large disaster with robust registration of individuals and households for IA support, something like a Hurricane Sandy, Harvey, or Maria event. But budgets should be provided to FEMA in an MS Excel. That's how we prefer to see them. This budget is just for discussional purposes, not really for format. Take note as well of what the total is that's shown here, $428,615, which is encompassed, as you can see, by personnel, many salary line items, travel, transportation. This will become important to remember that number in the next slide. So if you recall back to when I input the information in the tool, a disaster with an estimated $5 million at 30 days, the corresponding recipient management cost was just a little under $167,000. So obviously that won't support what we just saw in the previous slide, a budget estimate of $429,000. So then that was for 2 years worth of identified activities. So the question really then becomes, what should the 1 month to 6 month priorities really be for this particular recipient? This is where they have to refine their budget and identify the essential activities that they will include into their actual recipient management cost application to FEMA. The 6-month estimate is usually significantly higher than the 30-day estimate. This is the infusion of management costs, which can help a recipient build a support system for their Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. These are the management cost funds that will help that recipient coach subrecipients in preparing applications. And the funds support the subject matter expertise that they need to help that recipient themselves with their benefit costs, possibly their environmental and historic preservation reviews, and they'll be just building capacity using these funds. Obviously, the recipient management cost supports identified recipient staff costs and provides funding for needed equipment, supplies, and travel within that recipient agency. At the 1-year lock-in, the total recipient management cost funding amount is final. Now that the application portfolio has been submitted in NEMIS and in hard copy or digital format to the region, the recipient can begin to build out the technical support system to oversee the portfolio of sub-recipient projects once they are awarded. As I mentioned earlier, MS Excel spreadsheets are wonderful things, and they allow management cost budget manipulation at the 30-day, 6-month, and final lock-in obligation, and they can provide a very precise level of detail. In a workbook format, you can develop monthly, quarterly, and sub-recipient trackers. This could be a worksheet included with a Disaster Hazard Mitigation Grant Program management cost estimator tool, so it can easily be adjusted based on the 6-month estimate and final lock-in. It can accommodate sub-recipient management cost budget allocation and disbursements. Many states and regions do have good examples and templates, so reach out to them. Budgets for sub-recipient management costs will not be included in project budgets. There is a dedicated SRMC tab in NEMIS that is separate and distinct from the project budget, and I will have a future slide on that topic. Let's examine some weak and strong recipient management cost narratives and budget requests. What you're looking at here is one sentence, and this one sentence is what was actually provided to a region to request recipient management costs. So obviously you see a lot missing, a lot of detail missing, and this would not pass muster in order to be able to approve the recipient funds. We really do need to try to tease out the difference between the budget narrative and an actual budget. Both are necessary and require detail. So a narrative does not, cannot be overlooked and be as simple and cursory as the example that we're seeing here. This is a revised management cost budget narrative that the recipient submitted after discussion with the region following that first request. This is still at the 30 days. Will this support to execute grant notification, applicants briefings, and pre-application support? Would $250,000 support this for about 4 months? This example is at 6 months. It builds on that initial management cost budget request. Is there adequate detail here? Note that we've circled the fact that they are identifying 2 full-time employees, and they have identified as well that their indirect cost rate is at 10%. And here we are at the final 1-year lock-in. This budget narrative builds on that 6-month estimate, and the final amount has changed due to public assistance program grants. So the recipient needs to adjust their final management cost program narrative and budget request. Also during the year, the state changed its indirect cost rate from 10 to 8, as you can see here. Please also note that we've gone from that 2 full-time employee fiscal staff down to just 1 in this final 1 year. Okay, same drill as before. I'm going to show a couple of slides that have some questions on them. Then I will pause so that you can think about your responses. Then we will check your work. Construction, question number 5. Construction management activities that manage, coordinate, and supervise project installation are eligible management costs. Question 6. Indirect costs can include, and they list a series of 4 things. Question 7. Recipient HMGP overmatch and oversubscription budgets are included in the HMGP value used to calculate recipient management costs. And here are the correct answers. Now, I also have a second set of questions, so bear with me and we'll go to those. Question 8. Strategic fund management project management costs are included in your increments to cover recipient and subrecipient needs for no more than 1 year unless contractual agreements require more funds. Question 9. Recipient management costs are automatically added to HMGP allocations by FEMA. And question 10. Recipient and subrecipient management cost requests should include a detailed narrative and budget itemized into cost categories. Here are the correct answers. And for anyone who goes way back in FEMA history, question number 9 may have brought to mind the old days when each project did automatically have a prescribed amount of funding attached per a sliding scale for what we called admin costs. And to be clear, the DRRA did not bring back that model. Any SRMC that is desired must be applied for within each application. Okay, the recipient has requested and been obligated immediate and/or incremental funding needs. Now, what does the recipient need to do to assure proper use of those funds, as well as to guide subrecipients who are also using management costs? First, let's talk about the HMGP administrative plan. This is a procedural guide that details how the recipient will administer the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. Recipients must have a current administrative plan approved by FEMA before receiving HMGP funds. The admin plan checklist must be submitted with the admin plan itself, with the admin plan update, and we'll get to that checklist in just a moment. And the recipient may forward a new or updated admin plan to FEMA for approval at any time. We like to think that a good practice is for the recipient to review and update their admin plan annually. However, the basic requirement is that the HMGP administrative plan must be reviewed and updated following each new presidential major disaster declaration. And that way they are able to, the plan will include and meet the current policy guidance and/or changes in the administration of the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. As I mentioned, the checklist. This is just a little snapshot of the first page of the checklist. It identifies the minimum criteria that an HMGP admin plan must contain for FEMA approval. Note that it's a good idea for the admin plan to outline how the recipient will administer management costs, up to 5% for each subrecipient award when requested by the subrecipient. In a suggested sequential order, this is a list of HMGP recipient administrative plan related activities supporting administration of an HMGP recipient grant. If you are an entity that has an admin plan, you might want to pause at this point and just do a double check to make sure that you're covering all of these items within your current plan. We also did want to share with you this best practice. And this is a slide that we got from taking an example from a state, which shows that they're documenting whether or not a subrecipient wants to accept subrecipient management costs within their Hazard Mitigation Grant Program application, or if they want to decline those subrecipient costs. Just a bit more here on procurement. Don't forget that FEMA does have a reasonable cost document available on our website that was developed by FEMA Public Assistance. This guide can prove very useful for both recipients and subrecipient users. Recipients should reinforce and support setting up subrecipient tracking. This is something that is new for recipients because of the DRRA allowance. And the key takeaway is that, like any project, the subrecipient amounts can also be audited. So it is important that recipients develop their own procedures to monitor the subrecipient management cost use. Following the passage of the DRRA and the subsequent HMGP management cost changes, of course, FEMA mitigation had to undertake the drafting of the various management cost policy documents and other instructional materials that I've talked about. But in addition, we also needed to modify our electronic grant management system, known as NEMIS. That stands for the National Emergency Management Information System. Luckily, we did not need to alter the way recipients create their management cost applications, as our existing state management cost, or SMC, application abilities within NEMIS, they still provided the functionality, and we were able to adapt them to the new RMC needs. But note that the new management cost subrecipient tab on this application was put in place after the DRRA. That's the image on the left. And when you click on that tab, as we show in the corresponding example image on the right, there is now the addition of a field where you can submit for the SRMC management cost amount. It is a good recipient best practice for them to help their subrecipients set up their own simple Excel trackers for their grant awards costs, including their subrecipient management costs. Recipients should check in with them frequently during the first quarters to ensure they are tracking properly, and that way they're able to correct anything early. Reinforce that document retention requirement is necessary, and that should be spelled out and included in the state and local grant agreement. And by updating the plan, the admin plan, every calendar year, if that's what you chose to do, then that would be a nice way for you to be able to stay on top of any changes that are happening within our program. And that way, at the early days of after any post-disaster, you're not frantically trying to update that admin plan. You're able to know that you've already got an approved admin plan and can move forward with submission of applications and receipt of awards. Okay, the recipient has requested and been obligated immediate and/or incremental funding needs. Now, what does the recipient need to do to assure proper use of those funds, as well as to guide subrecipients who are also using management costs? Again, in a sequential order suggested by us, this is a list of HMGP subrecipient management cost administrative details. Feel free to pause your video and take this in. While FEMA does not require the detail of subrecipient management costs in recipient quarterly reporting, recipients do have a responsibility to encourage each subrecipient to follow the responsible administration of project management costs to include detailed subrecipient project management cost documentation and tracking. Be sure to extend separate financial tracking for all awarded HMGP projects, as well as other HMA, Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program grant projects. You want to keep the streams separate. Keep all sub-recipient project expense records, including management costs, for 3 years after the project has closed out. If a subrecipient does not request management costs, they cannot ask for management costs later. If the subrecipient reduces the total project cost, then the management cost will correspondingly also be reduced proportionally. Recipients perform a quarterly reconciliation of management costs for the subrecipient, while FEMA analyzes recipient management costs per the 2015 Hazard Mitigation Assistance Guidance. This is done to assure that management costs are not overspent. Poor Closeout. They're always the last thing that we talk about. But that does not diminish the importance of this phase of grants administration. As we have mentioned previously, here is where the RMC withholding sees the light of day. RMC projects must also be correctly closed out, just like projects. And this slide does a nice job of providing some reminders that should hopefully be easy to accommodate, given that you have good internal controls in place throughout the life of the management cost award. One last time, slides with questions, you form your answers, we review. Question 11, recipients should update their HMGP administrative plans. 4 options. Question 12, the recipient HMGP administrative plan and disaster HMGP mitigation strategy are the same thing. Question 13, recipients must inform subrecipients of subrecipient management cost availability. And here are the correct answers. Don't worry, I have just 2 last questions. Question 14. Subrecipient management cost best practices include 4 options there again. And question 15. Subrecipients include details of their HMGP project management cost use and obligation drawdown in their quarterly reports to the recipient. And here are the correct answers. Well, that brings us to the conclusion of the slide deck and the end of our time together. It is my sincere hope that you now have a much better understanding of the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program management costs. Perhaps you learned some things you did not know previously. Perhaps you just strengthened your existing knowledge. Either way, I thank you for your time and attention and wish you great success in navigating this aspect of the fascinating world of FEMA mitigation grants.